Anyway, Rob and Lori Byron are two of the senior authors of Climate Change and Human Health, a special report of the Montana Climate Assessment. And they're real experts in human health. Lori Byron is a pediatric hospitalist in Billings, and Rob Byron is an internist in Hardin. And both of them spent over 20 years working for Indian Health Service in Crow Agency. They are also founding members and active in Montana Health Professionals for a Healthy Climate, which is located in Red Lodge. I want to extend a personal thanks to Rob and Lori for letting us look at the Climate Change and Human Health report prior to its release date and use it as an important source for our recent science primer that we developed describing the likely changes from climate change in the Bitterroot Valley, which we recently presented to the city of Hamilton. And they also served as reviewers for that and provided lots of helpful comments. And I really think their help was integral to making it into a reasonably good product. Anyway, without boring you further, we're looking forward to your talk, and go ahead, Rob and Lori.
Okay, thank you, Kit. And okay, can everybody see our screen now? Is that sharing okay? Okay. Yes. Well, thanks for the invitation and thanks for the introduction. As Kit said, Lori and I are both physicians. She's a pediatrician, I'm an internist. For a long time, we were, I guess would say, environmentally aware, but not very active. And then about 10 years or so ago, we actually started looking at the literature a little more on it and had, you can either call it an epiphany, I call it more of an oh crap moment of realizing that from a health standpoint, if we didn't do something about climate change, what we do in the exam room won't make a lot of difference. And one thing led to another, and now we're going to use C2H2, which is what we call Climate Change and Human Health in Montana report, as kind of a guideline, and look at that a little more. Some of it will be about what's happening in Montana. Some of it will be a little broader. This is the report. It's available online at montanaclimate.org. And we'd recommend that you go there. There are lots of different links in there that you can go to, and there are relatively few hard copies available. I recommend using the online report. And one of the goals of this report was to identify those aspects of climate that are most likely to affect our physical and mental health of Montanans, and of special importance to suggest effective actions, things that we can do either as individuals or in our organizations or our churches or our government, but within the state to make a difference. Now, this is kind of a busy slide, but this was included in the report, but was originally part of the Lancet Countdown US brief in 2018. And the reason we included it is because it summarizes most of the health impacts that we expect from climate change. Across the top, we see increasing temperatures, extreme weather, rising sea levels, which obviously won't directly impact Montana, but will affect us, and extreme precipitation. And then across the center, some others, extreme heat waves, air pollution, which we will talk about in some detail in a minute, water contamination, increased allergens, and particularly important, food supply and quality and population displacement. And then at the bottom, the individual impacts on individual humans, everything from heat stress to lung and heart diseases, particularly important mental health impacts, as well as impacts on pregnant females and fetuses. And then obviously something we are unfortunately all too aware of in Montana is that physical trauma and death, in our case, a lot from wildfires, in other places from storms and things. And we'll talk a little more about these as we go on. But let's start a little more basic. Another busy slide, for which I apologize. I like graphs, and so I'll have several, but this one I think is particularly important. This is from the State of the Air 2020 from the American Lung Association. But what it shows, on the left, it's cut off a little bit, but that's 1970 at the bottom. And it shows, on the top, it shows growth in GDP, or gross domestic product, growth in population, miles traveled, a variety of things. But the bottom line that's getting less is actually the emissions. And that shows that our air quality is better now than it was several decades ago. And that is absolutely true. There's no questions. But I submit to you that's good, but it doesn't make a difference when it comes to climate change, because we've got a long way to go to make a difference there. Let's look a little more. Currently in the United States, air pollution, not climate change, air pollution, which is the cause of climate change, damages our health to the tune of anywhere from roughly 70,000 to 250,000 premature deaths in the United States every year. Now, even if our air quality is better now, that's an awful lot of people dying that don't need to be done. Worldwide, 1 in 5 premature deaths are linked to burning of fossil fuels. And if people have questions of why that big range, I'm happy to talk about it later during the Q&A session. So why is that, and what's important about this? A couple things. First of all, the main contributors to climate change are greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, nitrous oxides, and a few others. Carbon dioxide being the main one. Those are not the main ones that are killing people. The main thing that's killing people is our ozone, and this is ground level ozone, which is formed when sunlight hits other air pollutants like nitrous oxides and volatile organic compounds, and particulate matter. And particulate matter, I used to think of as, oh, it's just dust or dirt or something kind of benign. Wrong. It's not benign. Particulate matter is an extremely biologically active group of compounds and things. The PM 2.5 on this slide references the size, which is under 2.5 microns, which means it's less than 1/4 as big as a human red blood cell. And this just shows what happens when a little bit ozone, but particularly PM 2.5 gets in the body and we breathe it in. It leads to inflammation, which causes more heart attacks and strokes. It has negative impacts on preterm growth of fetuses and pregnancy. And it sets up inflammation in the lungs and leads to more asthma and more other pulmonary diseases. Now, in Montana, our air quality is, well, we like to think it's pretty good, and it sort of is, but let's put it in perspective. This information is also taken from a lot of it from State of the Air 2020. And in Montana, particulate matter, of the 10 counties that reported that in 2020, or I'm sorry, 13 counties, 10 got an F, 2 got a D, and 1 got a C. Now, ozone, we get an A on across the state, but there are also only 7 counties collecting data on ozone, which is part of the issue that we'll talk about. Now, looking at Missoula, and not to pick on Missoula because they are one of the leaders, certainly in the state and certainly in the region, but when rated for short-term particulate matter, they were 7th worst in the country. And spread over the entire year, they were 16th worst, and 93% of that was due to forest fire smoke, not to industry or traffic or other things, but forest fires. And in Montana, our air pollution sources in order are forest fires, geography from inversion layers in certain locales, and motor vehicles to a degree. And that's important. So when we talk about climate change, yes, we're talking about air pollution causing it, but climate change also worsens air pollution, which brings us to wildfires, and is one of the main concerns we identified in C2H2 in Montana for the main impacts of climate change. Now, are all wildfires due to climate change? No, but warmer temperatures are resulting in less winter kill of pests. Certainly, our longstanding forest management practices with fire suppression is a huge issue, no questions about that. But we also see earlier snowmelt, so there's less moisture later in the season. We see increased water loss from the plants due to warmer temperatures. We see decreased soil moisture from warmer temperatures. And interestingly, we see increased lightning strikes from warmer temperatures. Now, this last one's, I thought, just interesting and worth pointing out. Most fires are not caused by lightning, but the number or percentage will increase, because for every degree centigrade increase in warming, lightning strikes increase about 10%. Combine that with dry, brittle forests, and we have more recipe for disaster there. In Montana, our annual fire season is about 78 days longer than it was in the 1970s. So let's change topics a little bit and look at heat. What do we expect, which is the other really big concern we have about climate change in Montana. In Montana, the days over 90 degrees are expected to increase by anywhere from 5 to 35 days a year by mid-century. Now, this impacts, in addition to human, obviously it has great impacts on the onset and severity of drought, which are harder to predict. Now, it's also worth pointing out that in Montana, we looked at days over 90 degrees. In the Southwest and the South United States, they're looking at days over 105 degrees, which are increasing dramatically. So in some sense, we're a little bit fortunate by being further north. And what do we expect from heat? What does it do? Well, already it's the #1 cause of death in the United States from weather-related events, with about 12,000 people per year dying from heat-related illness. Now, some of those are from ones you might think of: heat exhaustion, heat stroke, dehydration. But a lot more of them are for other things, which increase with warmer temperatures: heart attacks, stroke, suicides, lung illnesses, and there's even suggestion that there is increased risk of diabetes from warmer temperatures. Now, people who have diabetes are at higher risk from complications, yes, but it may also cause more people to get diabetes. And our thinking gets worse as it gets warmer. Another issue that to mention, and it's because we didn't make as big an issue about it in the C2H2 report, but that is infectious diseases. And this is the reason to mention it and the reason to make a little bit of an issue about it. This shows vector-borne diseases, which are diseases spread by ticks in Montana, at least primarily, with the cases reported starting in 2003 at the top, going through 2018 at the bottom. And you'll notice that the numbers aren't very high. We start with a couple and we get up to anywhere from 30 to 35, about half of which were cases from that people got elsewhere, not in the state. However, if we look at the United States as a whole, it's a very different story. These are disease cases from infected mosquitoes, ticks, and fleas, which have tripled in about 13 years, between 2004 and 2016. And that's exactly what we're expecting to see worldwide, is as temperatures warm, vectors, particularly mosquitoes, fleas, and ticks, can cover broader ranges. They often tend to bite more. The parasites or the germs tend to breed faster. And this is the kind of spread that we're expecting to see and actually are seeing in more tropical regions as well. Now, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lori.
So thanks everybody for taking your time to be here tonight. And thanks for giving your time and energy for so many of you that are on the call to increase the climate awareness in your region. I'm sure it's already making a big difference. Every climate report that's been written emphasizes that there are people more at risk, and Montana's C2H2 is no different. Frequently, these are people with less means, but there are a couple other groups who are at higher risk in Montana too. So Montana's at-risk groups include the very old, the very young, the very pregnant, the indigenous populations, the poor, people with chronic conditions, and people who are already disadvantaged in our society, like people with physical or mental deficits, outdoor workers and rural workers. A whole chapter of C2H2 talks about these vulnerable groups. Rob and I worked in a total of 50 years between the two of us in Crow Agency, and the region experienced a flood about a decade ago. The interstate was closed for a few days, and nurses had to take medicine out in motorboats and rowboats to patients and whatnot. And it made them national news, but not for very long. And about 2 weeks later, the interstate was open. Anybody driving by would think, no problem. But for the vulnerable in our community, it was a problem. And it was a problem for many years after. For some of the families that were living on the edge, barely getting by at poor paying jobs, it was just too much. Losing their clothing or the drywall or the furniture in their house was too big of a loss. And years later, some of them were still living in FEMA trailers or crowded into a relative's spare bedroom or in a car or in that same house that's now mold infested. And you simply can't live a healthy lifestyle or raise your family well in those conditions. So if you're disadvantaged for any reason, whether it's a physical disability, a person with no political voice like children, or living in poverty, climate's going to affect you more. So children, fetuses, and women are of particular interest to me because I'm a pediatrician, and they are all vulnerable populations for a number of reasons. From the very beginning, fertility is actually affected by air pollution, and there's been good studies showing both car air pollution, traffic pollution, and fossil fuel power plants affect our fertility, and the fertility then improves if we get away from those regions. But exposure to heat and particulate matter breathed in by pregnant moms affects their fetuses. So there's been a lot of research done that indicates that both hotter than normal average temperatures or heat waves during the pregnancy or breathing in particulate matter puts a pregnant mom at increased risk of delivering prematurely, delivering a baby that goes on to die of sudden unexplained infant death, or what we used to call crib deaths or SIDS deaths, or delivering a baby that has IUGR or intrauterine growth retardation. And IUGR is not just developing a scrawny baby, it's actually something that has lifelong implications. So for instance, if you are born smaller, all your organs are smaller, including your pancreas, which means that the number of cells that produce insulin in your pancreas are less than what would normally be expected. So you're actually at higher risk of developing diabetes when you're born small for dates. Research indicates that 3% of our preterm births in the United States are due to air pollution, about 16,000 a year. And in 2003 in California, they documented decreases in birth weight just from wildfire smoke, not from other kinds of pollution. And of course, the stress associated with wildfires, like other stress to pregnant women, can have negative effects on them also. But at the same time, we have to emphasize as physicians, we can't say which preterm birth or which heart attack is caused by a wildfire or caused by another form of air pollution. It's certainly suspicious when you have a heart attack or you deliver a premature baby during the middle of a bad fire season, but we can't prove that. Fetuses are exquisitely sensitive to the dirty air breathed in by their mom in many ways. So besides the problems around the birth, exposure to air pollution during pregnancy has also been linked to decreased lung function in infancy and childhood, increased respiratory symptoms, and the development of child asthma. And those things all kind of make sense because we think about breathing in air pollution into our lungs. But remember that those particles of particulate matter actually get into our bloodstream, which is probably what causes the heart attacks and strokes, and they get into our brain. So dirty air has been linked to neurodevelopmental problems like learning disabilities, lower IQ, attention deficit disorder, and autism and dementia. Again, there's a lot of conditions that cause those problems, but air pollution is one of them. By mid-century, if business continues as usual, Eastern Montana will have about 33 more days a year, more than what we already have, with temperatures over 90 degrees. And already most of Eastern Montana counties have a medium high to a high, what's called a heat vulnerability rating. And these ratings look at income and employment and other factors in addition to the anticipated heat. This also affects the amount of food grown. In 2017, this was the worst recorded drought in history for Eastern Montana, stage 5 drought. I didn't even know there were levels of stages of drought, but the crops were down by 1/4 in Eastern Montana. And this also then affects the economics in the region and affects the mental health of those who are living there. So pediatricians are really concerned about nutrition, and nutrition is affected by climate change, and that affects children. So it's a great concern to me. So we just talked a little bit about the effects of heat, but ag production is also affected by these extreme weather events and by heat and by drought. But also the increased carbon dioxide in our atmosphere presents a problem for agriculture. So the increased CO2 in the air causes our grain plants to grow better. And that makes sense because we all learned back in Biology 101 that plants like CO2, and they do. But the reason they like it is because they can grow better, because they can produce carbohydrates more easily, because carbohydrates are carbon-based particles. So when they contain more carbon, the plants actually have fewer micronutrients and less protein. And so that's a problem if it's a food crop. The verdict is still out on the ultimate effect of that on our children, but we know in the US that about 20% of children are low on iron at some point during their childhood, usually their early childhood. And iron is one of the plant nutrients that's decreased because of higher air levels of CO2. And as a pediatrician, I can tell you that even in the US with good healthcare and affordable medicines, people hate to give iron to their kids because it tastes god-awful. And I saw many kids go for years with low iron levels. And childhood iron deficiency actually leads to a lower IQ. And even a 1-point decrease in IQ affects your eventual social status and your salary. So having more kids with low iron is a significant health concern. Rob mentioned a little bit about heat and the ticks and mosquitoes and whatnot, but the same thing happens with the pests and pestilence that affect our crops. They live longer, they cover a larger swath of the earth, and they grow faster, they breed more, they eat more, and they produce more. So that's the problem too. Food insecurity is an issue in the US and in Montana, where we have about 12% of our households are food insecure. It was actually much higher than that over the last year because of COVID. But as crop production is affected around the world with drought, with heat, with desertification, with saltwater intrusion on our coasts, and increasingly severe weather events, food prices will continue to rise around the world and in Montana. That's not going to affect most of us on this call very much, but it's certainly going to affect our Montana children who are in food insecure households, those 12%. And food insecurity as a child is not a benign problem. There's actually been a lot of research done on it, and it's been well shown that it's associated with many significant health problems like diabetes and depression, anxiety, alcoholism. But there's also a lot of hope in the ag sector, so I have to spend a couple minutes on this slide. This sector, of course, is now a carbon source, but it can actually become a carbon sink instead. And experts think that we can feed the world with sustainable agriculture. In fact, a lot of people think we have to feed the world within the next couple decades with sustainable agriculture. So farmers markets are blossoming. There's more than 90,000 of them in the United States. When you are out walking in a farmer's market in your own community, you actually have a stronger sense of community. And that's been well shown to improve your health, your mental health and your physical health. You tend to buy more local produce, and you even grow more produce because people are concerned about chemicals. When a WIC recipient lives within walking distance of a farmer's market, they actually eat 1.4 more servings per day of fruits and vegetables, and that's really significant. And then we have the community-supported agriculture projects. And again, it's local. The majority of them are using less chemicals and are less polluting than industrial agriculture, and we eat healthier. When we practice more local sustainable agriculture like farmers markets or CSAs or homegrown vegetables, our diets actually improve and the food is healthier, and that sustainable agriculture helps sequester carbon and can decrease the carbon in our atmosphere. As of 2018, about 6% of our food in America is organic, and probably higher than that now because it's been growing continuously over the last decade or so. And so when we look at things like free-range eggs and grass-fed meat, we have higher levels of omega-3s, which improves our brain function and our cardiovascular health. There's less pesticides, and pesticides have been linked to a whole host of health problems, including cancers. And if worse comes to worse, even people that don't like to garden can garden, like happened in World War II, because all the fruits and vegetables were sent overseas to the soldiers and people started growing their victory gardens. And people actually grew 40% of the fruits and vegetables they ate. We have a lot bigger yards now, so we can do that again. Weather's an issue, and Rob has mentioned heat, but we have increased frequency of extreme weather also. So around the world, about 60,000 deaths a year. In the US, about 2,000 deaths a year from extreme weather events. And there's also this problem about climate refugees. In 2018, we actually had over 1 million US citizens in the US 50 states that were climate refugees. And worldwide, it's in the tens of millions every year. When Hurricane Katrina happened, that was 2005, there was almost 1 million homes that were destroyed. And a couple 100,000 people left New Orleans and southern Louisiana. And they moved all over the United States. This is just a map showing where they moved to. And you even have people in the Bitterroot Valley, and we have them in Bighorn County, that came here because of Hurricane Katrina. So climate refugees are sometimes able to return home, but sometimes not. So it's predicted that about 1 in 12 people in the US South could be forced to relocate in the next 45 years. And who knows, maybe that's why we're having this huge housing boom, like we were discussing on the call before we started this talk tonight. Because of the hurricanes, the things that are affecting the coast, the wildfires, and I heard Peter mention tonight the people from Oregon that were moving to Montana because of their wildfires. There is a lot of issues with climate displacement. And remember, when people are moving, like when people moved because of Hurricane Katrina, it wasn't just like having a job and moving to another city. They were moving because they lost a large percentage of what they had. That's a big difference. Algae blooms are also more common. They increase in warmer waters, and they are increasing in Montana, and they can lead to death of animals or people. And we saw in Bozeman last year, a couple dogs died in a lake with an algae bloom. It affects the kid's ability to play and exercise. It erodes a child's confidence that the world is a safe place, because these algae blooms are not safe. For indigenous youth in Montana and elsewhere, the unpredictability of the seasons and the alterations of traditional food gathering that's already occurring is just one more issue that endangers the retention of their culture. And these changes to traditional foods are of great concern to our tribal elders. Fortunately, a number of our tribes are actually more proactive than a lot of other parts of Montana as far as working on climate issues. And the Blackfeet is just one of them. Wildfire smoke leads to alterations in our lives. For children, there's less outdoor playtime and exercise, limitations on sporting events. And I've heard so many people from Western Montana talk about how difficult it was to have a month of their summer and be unable to enjoy the outdoors. This has a huge effect on our well-being. And just remember, when it's crummy outside and we're not supposed to be exercising vigorously outside, the people that are living in substandard housing are breathing that same particulate matter in when they're indoors. So they're getting more exposure and having more damage. Children are actually still developing their lungs for the first 7 years of life. And so there's a lot of concern of what this dirty air does to children. Some of you might have heard, but there is some research ongoing at Seeley Lake since the fires there in 2017, I think. And it showed that there was lung damage in adult people's lungs that continued at least 2 years after a smoke event. So both wildfire smoke and the increased pollen season resulting from climate change leads to more people having more asthma and more asthmatic attacks. A lot of you have probably seen this air quality flag chart. And this it's posted in a lot of places, but it's posted on the Montana DPHHS's air quality website. On orange days, sensitive groups should remain inside. And if they're outside, they should avoid vigorous activity. And all children under the age of 18 are considered a sensitive group, which means you shouldn't be doing sports during that time. We saw last year, even when we weren't having severe wildfires in Montana, that there were large areas of Montana for significant periods of time that had bad air quality that affected, again, our ability to live a normal life. And the red and the purple days are particularly dangerous for everybody. So these prolonged wildfire events affect our mental health also. As Rob mentioned a little bit, we don't have enough people in Montana to really look at statistics on a lot of issues, but in other parts of the country with larger populations, they've documented significant mental health concerns, depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress due to wildfire. And many studies show that children are affected more. Most of us know someone, maybe even ourselves, whose mental health suffered during a fire season. And not to mention the stresses that occur if we have forced evacuations or we lose our home or our livelihood. I was happy to see that both the Healthy Gallatin and the Climate Smart Missoula website under their wildfires talk about the concerns for mental health. Our mental health is also affected by heat, and increased heat increases all forms of violence, including domestic abuse, child abuse, and suicides. And we are already near the top, usually around 4th in the nation for youth suicide in Montana. There was research published just last year after a survey was done of Montana farmers and ranchers, and nearly 3/4 of the farmers and ranchers that were surveyed, there was 125 of them, believe that climate change is having an adverse effect on their operations. And they felt moderate to high levels of anxiety regarding climate effects on their agricultural business. So climate change can be a scary topic, so scary that many people as a defense mechanism choose to ignore it. Fortunately, a lot of you on this call aren't in that group. And it can be so big of a problem that some people feel like it's useless to try to do anything. But there are actually benefits to ourselves in the short term for taking action. It's been scientifically proven that doing something, doing anything, fighting back makes us feel better. Fortunately for the Bitterroot, there was a smaller and now a growing group of you that are willing to fight back, to educate, to act, to activate, and to address this problem. So Rob will now go on to talk about some actions.
Well, the one, as you all know, you're taking many of the actions already. Your resiliency plan and climate plan is a huge step, not only just in developing it, but actually the processes of talking with people about it and then bringing it to the attention of policymakers is huge. There are a lot of things, and including in the C2H2 report, it has quite a few individual actions, and for individuals, it can be for people, it can be for healthcare professionals and clinics or healthcare systems, for policymakers, for organizations, and probably the most important thing of all of those is something like this, and that is we actually talk about it. What most of us aren't very good about, though, is talking about it with our friends and family. Sometimes it's easier to get up in front of a crowd than it is to talk to your brother or your cousin or your mother who doesn't agree with you on this. But that's what needs to happen. We need to make conversation about this normal, not divisive. And a lot of what you're doing with BCAG addresses that. At the public health and environmental health level, there's also lots of interest, and especially with the current federal administration, to really ramp this up at two levels. One of them is prevention or mitigation, and the other is preparation. And what's going to happen? Well, if it's too hot during the summer, where are people going to go? What are we going to do? If the smoke is too bad, how can we help them? We can't stop the smoke, and a variety of other issues. And the Building Resilience Against Climate Effects is a framework that has been used with public health agencies and can be very effective. It provides toolkits and other things, as you all have done in your plan as well with your primer. And also, both Lori and I and other members of Montana Health Professionals for a Healthy Climate are happy to come and give talks, hopefully in person soon, versus over Zoom, but over Zoom as well, to anybody. You know, a crowd of one or more is all we request. And to just start these conversations and make people aware. And let's get beyond where we are now with this. The other thing particularly is becoming aware, and we will see more of, is there is funding opportunities available, especially nowadays when it has environmental justice built into it, which almost every climate action does address environmental justice in some way or another. But there's quite a bit of funding available for nonprofits, certainly for underserved populations, and at various levels of government. So we can't use that excuse as much as we used to. The other thing is, as you all are already doing, but for those who haven't been as active with BCAG, is get involved with a group like BCAG and others. One of the big pushes of late is to bring all of the organizations together so that we're working towards mutual goals and not undermining each other. But groups like Climate Smart Montana, Climate Smart Glacier Country, Blackfeet Climate Change Adaptation Plan, and then Montana Health Professionals for Healthy Climate. To finish up, as we say it, that climate change is the world's greatest group participation project. We either work together or we all lose. And with that, we'll open it up to questions.
I think there were some questions in the chat. Did those go away? Okay. Not really questions.
Oh, okay, so better constantly rising. So from Salim, better air quality. What about the constant rising levels of CO2? Agreed. And there is some data actually that does suggest the increased level of CO2 itself is having some health impacts. In terms of the direct impacts on health, though, it's probably more the particulate matter and the ozone, ground level ozone that we're seeing now. And there's also, I'm discounting things like nitrous oxides and sulfur oxides and things like that as well, which are a much bigger issue in urban areas than most of us are subject to in Montana.
A little bit more explanation. So the Clean Air Act's been around for 50 years, and it has regulated the things like nitrous oxide and sulfur dioxide and particulate matter and lead that are in the atmosphere. And those things have gone down. It has not really regulated CO2. We have yet to regulate CO2 in the United States. That's what the Clean Power Plan was supposed to do, but it never got implemented. So you're right. The CO2 continues to rise, and some of the times that some of the regulations that the scrubbers that were put on, various fossil fuel power plants, those sorts of things, they helped a little bit with CO2, but not much. They largely were going against air pollutants, other air pollutants.
Another aspect of that to address. It didn't come up here, but it's come up with others, and that is during the shutdown from COVID globally, we saw dramatic improvements in air quality, especially in urban areas. And I'm sure everybody saw the pictures of mountains that you couldn't see all of a sudden are very visible. And there's no question that makes a difference. In terms of climate, it's inconsequential. It makes a difference for health for those local areas for that time, but it has to be much longer and a much more to impact climate. And that's going to be a whole different issue or related issue, I guess.
However, important to note that we can address climate change and actually help the economy and help jobs and not create economic collapse like COVID did. So that's important to point out.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question, if I can put it at you. I would be really curious about, because I've been retired for some time, so I really don't know the stance of the AMA or the APA as far as that goes, which was my organization for way too long. I'm really curious, is there backing from the AMA, APA, and other organizations like that on a broad front within the US?
Yes. Unequivocally, all the major health organizations, professional organizations, American Public Health Association, all the societies have come out with, I think with a couple of exceptions, very strong position statements that climate change is an important and urgent issue that we need to address. There's also now an organization called the Medical Society Consortium on Climate and Health, which is basically bringing all the professional societies under one roof to focus on climate change issues. And they now represent over 600,000 licensed health professionals in the US and have done quite a bit of work in that regard. At a different level though, in the trenches, as we say, or down at the grassroots level in the exam room, it's a tougher sell. It's harder. There's one, we have people all over the spectrum in terms of political beliefs, but more importantly, when people are taking care of individual patients, they're usually swamped and really swamped for time. So how to integrate more information into an already very condensed visit is extraordinarily difficult. There's work being done on that to help, but in many cases, it's just, oh, that's one more thing I have to do when I can't get to what I already needed to do anyway. So yes, there's a little bit of a disconnect there, but it's not for lack of support at the higher levels, including AMA, by the way.
There has been 2 studies done just in this past year on pediatric practices. It was in Wisconsin and Pittsburgh. So, reasonably conservative parts of the country, and the vast majority of the parents appreciated climate education and thought it was appropriate. So that was actually a really good thing. That's the first time it's been shown in research. The American Psychiatric and the American Psychologic are both all over climate change, and they have some really strong statements. I think we might have introduced you, Frank, to the Climate Psychiatry Alliance, which is a group, NGO started just to do climate work. But they have statements. They're doing a lot of education at their national meetings. There's been a lot of action.
Coming back to wildfires, do you guys see home air filters, HEPA filters, and that sort of thing being like essential equipment that people should be able to get hold of?
Yeah, at this point, it's about the best we have. And yes, it does. We think it's going to make a difference. Using, I can say, related data, which was done actually by Tony Ward at University of Montana, showed that for wood stoves, which basically produced particulate matter. The only thing that made a difference in reducing that was whether you had a HEPA filter. And we're talking, portable HEPA filters. Some people can put them in if they have an air conditioning system, which a lot of us in Montana don't have, and put them in, but that's harder to do. Portable HEPA filters can make a difference, especially when smoke is in the air.
And a number of schools looking at their stimulus money that that schools are getting and are going to be getting because of COVID. A number of school districts have actually started looking at improving their HVAC system so that they do have better filtration, which affects COVID, but also affects wildfire, which is a good thing. And it might be worth checking with your local school districts and seeing what they're planning on doing with the money. There's always tons of things schools need, but that's one of them.
Well, just for your information, when I used to work at the Rocky Mountain Labs as a microbiologist, and they have a really very good HVAC system, and they were even in 2000 putting HEPA filters on the system. But we still had a lot of wildfire smoke in the halls.
Wow.
But there's one more comment in the chat. It's not directly health related necessarily, but it's an potential indirect effect on wildfires. And maybe you could comment on that.
Yeah. Salim said, lots of data strongly suggests that the increase we're seeing in wildfires is directly the result of increasing levels of CO2 in the atmosphere, i.e. climate collapse. I certainly can't argue against that, not my area of expertise. On the other hand, given what Lori talked about on nutritional grains and things, yes, plants may grow better with higher CO2, but not necessarily be healthier. And then when we throw other stressors on top of them with increased pests, more heat, less moisture when they need it, it certainly would make sense. But I'm not aware of studies to that. I'm just naive to that.
I think for so many conditions that they consider climate change to be a threat multiplier. So you guys live in national forest country, and so you are at risk for wildfire. But depending on what the issue is, climate change is a huge threat multiplier to wildfire. It's a huge threat multiplier to national security and to many other things. So.
Can you hear me okay? My margin. Okay, great. Is anybody in the state at this point looking, I don't know, researching, I guess is the term I'm wanting, in migration and the impact of that in relation, climate caused in migration directly? I don't know how that can be split out, but also the impacts, particularly on water, quality and quantity is a concern that I'm familiar with or feel about. But is anybody looking at that? Is that something that we can ask for research?
Well, there was data about that in the Missoula Climate Ready report a couple of years ago, that they actually had a component which looked at climate refugees or climate migration or climate displacement, forcing people to come to Montana, and had some information on that. Now, I don't know, Laura, I would suspect there's more research going on. In this day and age with COVID, though, that's going to be such a confounder and, actually synergize or make it more as people try to get away from coasts and big cities. But I don't know at this point, but we'll certainly find out. That's a great question. And as I mentioned, even though we don't have coastal storms, we will be impacted by coastal storms.
Hillary, you're muted.
Yeah, thank you. I just got that message. Yeah, so my question is, in your conversations and in your dealings with health professionals in Montana, what are you finding in terms of awareness and maybe growing awareness of climate change and needing to do something about it? So, I mean, you talked about some of the other states and some awareness there, but what have you experienced or heard about Montana health professionals?
Well, when I first gave a talk at the Academy of Pediatrics meeting 3 or 4 years ago, I think the biggest reaction was shock. People just saying, I had no idea that all these things were affected by climate change. I don't know what kind of response you got from the internal medicine doctors.
Right, and I think over the past 4 to 5 years, we've gone from, and it's not just within health professionals, but and maybe as a nation, have gone from, it's really not happening, or I don't believe it, to, oh, yes, now we're learning a little bit more, and it's realizing, but the key is, what can we do about it, and how do we do something about it? I would say, particularly for health professionals, with the exception of nurses and public health officials, which is not the biggest segment of the healthcare professionals, most physicians, especially nurse practitioners and others, are not used to speaking up in a public, particularly politically charged environment. And getting people to do that, get out of the exam room, because these other things affect our patients' health, is difficult and has been, but it's also a big push by a lot of organizations, because we realize that actually that does make a difference. And we have to do more than just deal with an individual patient if we want to help all of our patients.
I would say, I think pediatricians are probably the most advocacy related of professionals. So we've been used to, for many years, advocating for mentally disabled children in the school system, for example, or various things like that. So I think pediatricians have kind of jumped on climate, maybe more so than a lot of the other groups. So actually in Montana this year, it's the first time ever that we had physicians testifying on bills in Congress related to renewable energy. And we actually decided with our group, Montana Health Professionals for a Healthy Climate, we actually decided that we were not going to lobby with that as a title behind our name, thinking it actually could be detrimental because the climate was so negative towards energy issues this year. But the pediatricians were, the Academy of Pediatrics in Montana were willing to stick their neck out on it. So when I testified, it was usually representing the Academy of Pediatrics this year. So,
yeah.
We do have...
Excellent, thank you for that.
We have about 160 health professionals, I think, have joined Montana Health Professionals for a Healthy Climate. COVID kind of slowed down our ability to go to meetings and talk to people about it. If anybody on the call has anything in their life related to health, it doesn't matter if you're a nurse's aide or a dietitian in the hospital, whatever. We have a very broad definition of what a health professional is, and we'd love to have you join up with us. Sign on for a newsletter.
Thank you.
Any more questions? Well, if there aren't any more questions, I guess I'd like to personally thank Rob and Lori for sort of, I'd say, a tour de force on health effects of climate change and effects in Montana, and plus providing us with a little, some things that we can do in order to address those. Thank you very much.
Thanks, and thanks for all your all's work. We very much appreciate it and hearing about it.
All right. Thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you
Stay
so
safe.
much. Bye-bye.